Hello and welcome to the Financial Puzzle Playbook with your host, Jim Sumpter. I'm RJ Malik, producer of this podcast, and we're continuing the discussion. And like we do every podcast, the 6 puzzle pieces. And this is going to be another interesting podcast, Jim. You've got a topic, obviously, it ties into finances, but it goes in a different direction. So why don't you take it away?
It absolutely does. RJ, great to see you. And I'll touch on what this is. So this episode is going to touch on all 6 areas of financial planning, which has been a while since we've reminded. So I want to do that. It's cash flow, retirement, insurance, investments, income taxes, and estate. And I have back with us a guest that we had a few episodes ago, Amanda Callahan, who is going to talk in a very different perspective today with this episode. We did a part 1 and 2 series where we talked about events, and that's Amanda's background. Today, we're going to take it to more of a personal level. Amanda is recently married, and we thought it would be a good idea to talk about the conversations that you had with your fiance, Jonathan, who is now your husband, with Jonathan as y'all led up to getting married. Yeah. So before we jump into this, tell us briefly sort of the history that y'all have had. I know you're also, you're still very, very young. Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
But,
Thank you.
but you're not in your 20s.
That's right.
Okay. So you waited a little while to get married. Jonathan waited a little while to get married. So kind of set that up for us.
Yeah. So we are just 2 very independent people coming into a relationship and now a marriage. We both had established households and finances and careers and things like that I think is a little bit different than the younger ones coming in maybe out of college or, straight from college or mom and dad's house, things like that.
Right. So is it okay to say you're in your 30s, he's in his 40s? Yeah. And so that's sort of, I wanted to set the stage because you mentioned that you're both established, you've both have careers. Right. Now his career is a little more dangerous than yours. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Jonathan and what does he do?
So he is a captain with the Birmingham Fire Department.
Okay.
And he also is a commercial business owner. So
okay.
So on his other days of not being, fighting fires and all of that, he owns a business.
Okay. And we're going to get into, because of his profession, some of the conversations that y'all had. Yeah. As you were thinking about getting married. How long did y'all date before you decided to tie the knot?
So, we dated for about 3 years.
About 3 years.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's jump into this. You both had worked separately. You both have established your careers. You've established your own financial world. Mm-hmm. So if I look at those 6 puzzle pieces, Amanda had her puzzle pieces. Yep. Jonathan had his puzzle pieces. Right. Is it fair to say that you were pretty satisfied with yours and he was satisfied with his? And now all of a sudden we're going to bring these 2 together.
Yes.
And so as you started, thinking, okay, this is going to go somewhere, we're going to get married. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about the discussions that began around the finances.
Yeah. So I think initially when we knew that things were progressing to a serious manner, it was very much, well, I have my house and you have your house and I really like my house, but I really, so we were both kind of tiptoeing of, well, who's going to give up what?
Okay.
And, and how do you work through that dynamic? Whereas, you already have a furnished house and so do I, but I really like my bed. I don't like yours. How do we work through some of those little bit of idiosyncrasies, but also matter because those were investments that we both had made independently. And
you weren't coming from, I know when I had, when I was in college, I had a hand-me-down that was maybe a second or third or fourth generation hand-me-down couch. So honestly, honestly, I had no intention of keeping my couch.
Yes.
When I went into marriage.
Yes.
You probably didn't have that. Jonathan probably didn't have that. So you had some nicer things.
That's right.
So now all of a sudden you have to decide. So who brought it up first?
Well, naturally I did.
You did. Okay. Yeah. Well, I probably knew I didn't know the answer, but I could have assumed the answer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as you're bringing this up, one of the questions is, okay, where are we going to live?
Mm-hmm.
How did y'all work through that?
I think it just became more of what made more sense.
Okay.
So I was in a townhouse. He had a, one level family house. And so we kind of looked at what made sense for his business. He has, a huge commercial truck, things like that. 3-car garage versus my 2. And so we kind of looked at those dynamics of what makes more sense, not just for the everyday life, but for the business and things like that. And it really did make more sense for me to give up my space and to move into his.
Okay. So if you're moving into his space, are we keeping his things? Are we moving your things in? How did y'all work through that?
I want you to know that this was harder than most every other topic we will talk about today.
Okay.
This conversation was the hardest because he has very big man-sized furniture, and I still, to this day, don't like it. So that will tell you that I gave up most of my things.
Okay.
Yes.
What did you keep?
I kept a bed suit for one of the guest rooms.
Okay.
I kept dining room table, some bar stools, things like that. But he won most of that.
He won most of that. Okay.
He did.
Okay.
He talks a good game.
Well, because his things were too big to move. It would have been too cumbersome to move out.
Don't encourage him. Don't encourage him.
Okay, let's jump to the money side.
Yeah.
Okay, because now, you had your established checking accounts, your way of doing things, your way of paying bills.
Yep.
He probably had the same. How did that conversation start and who started it?
Yeah. So I think this was kind of a mutual conversation that we both wanted to feel that we were contributing equally to the relationship and to the household. Again, both of us very independent, neither one of us wanting to feel like we weren't pulling a certain weight or whatever that looks like. And so we both sat down and said, if I'm moving into your home, what does that look like for you? How do you feel about my contribution and where does that make most sense? If you're already paying for the mortgage, it doesn't make sense for me to come in and try to take that over, right? So for us, it made more sense for him to take care of kind of the hardware, the home, outside of the home, and for me to take care of the interior of the home and everything that goes into the operations of the home.
Okay, so let's talk about that just a little bit. When you say the exterior, so that's the mortgage, is that the utilities, the yard service, all those things, and then you're more groceries and
so groceries, utilities, internet, phones, those kinds of things that make the everyday run.
So literally the inside of the house and the outside of the house. I like the way you talk about that. Yeah, that's kind of, and is that working?
It works great.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Separate bank accounts or joint?
Separate.
Okay. Did you have those conversations?
We did.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And why did you, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, because I will tell you, I work with a ton of couples. They all have, joint accounts or they all have separate accounts. How did y'all come to that conclusion?
I think, again, it just goes back to being independent and having an established way of doing things already. I think for us, I know that he's financially responsible. I don't have to ask what he's spending his money on, nor do I necessarily want to know or need to know. If you're ordering from Amazon, I don't need to know. And I don't want to tell you if I'm ordering from Amazon, right? So I think it just...
The truck showing up every day knows.
Well, that part, when the boxes are on the front porch every day.
Right.
But I think it just goes back to an independent situation where we're both established in our careers. We, have both worked really hard. I think it just felt really natural to keep things the way that they were going.
Okay. What about benefits? We talked about that. Jonathan's a firefighter, so that is in using your word, a more dangerous job.
Right.
What type of conversations have you had around that?
Yeah, so it was really important for us to sit down and say, if the worst happened and something happened to you where you did not come home that day, what does that look like for me as your wife, as your partner, right? Is it that I'm your beneficiary? What does that documentation look like? What happens to your pension? What happens to those things if you are not here? I feel like it's just more an investigative conversation of what does that look like? And what are those hard conversations that we have to have? Because you are putting yourself every day in a really dangerous situation that most people are not in.
Right. And these are conversations you had before you tied the knot.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. And how long before you got married did you start having these conversations?
I would say probably a year, maybe a year and a half.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because we were looking long term. We knew we were headed in that direction, and it was really, again, what if something happened to you, and then to me, right? If something happened to you tomorrow, am I homeless tomorrow? What does that look like?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Amanda, what you're talking about is financial planning. The whole reason we have this podcast is the Financial Puzzle Playbook, because every individual, every couple has their own financial puzzle. What you're talking about is something that generally couples begin talking about after they're married.
Interesting.
What you're talking about are topics before you're married.
Interesting.
Yes. So and I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. It's just that's a general,
Okay.
the way. But I think maybe because you are a little later in life, you were already established.
Right.
These are things that I think evolve and we learn about. And y'all had already kind of covered the pieces, and now you're just having conversations. I also love the fact that you had conversations.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. And I'm certainly no therapist of any sorts, although sometimes I feel like I should be.
I'll agree with you on that. Yeah.
But this is very interesting. So what did you conclude as you're talking about these sorts of things?
Yeah. So we ultimately agreed that I would be the beneficiary. That made most sense.
Okay.
If there are certain directives that he wanted me to do in case something happened to him, then I absolutely will honor that. And those documentations were drawn up for that. But ultimately, I'm his partner.
Right. Yeah. Right. One thing that you and I talked about, and I asked this question as we were preparing for this episode, is have either one of you ever lived in a community property state?
Oh, yeah.
And so what's interesting about this conversation is if your answer had been yes, that would sort of change some of the planning aspects going forward.
Yeah.
So if you're in a community property state, and there are 9 of them, it's let's say Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Washington, Idaho, Wisconsin, Nevada, then you're in a community property state. And what that means is when you are a married couple, the assets that you bring into the marriage are yours. The assets that you achieve while you are married, you own 50-50. And so it's really important as we're talking about financial planning. That is a question that a lot of times, and I always try to ask it in our questionnaire, have you ever lived in a community property state? Because if you had, some of these topics that you're discussing the answers could have been different.
Absolutely.
And so it's something that's really, really important for listeners to understand is that's a real question.
Right. Yeah.
And if you were to ever move to one of those, you need to understand what you have done.
See, I just learned that.
Right. And it's not it's not a bad thing.
Right.
It's just it's another part of financial planning that you have to think about.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Cassidy, the second C in CMC Financial. So Dad sometimes gets on a roll with this podcast and might forget to remind you about a few things. 1, don't forget to like and share this podcast and leave a review. 2, follow CMC Financial on all of the socials, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And 3, go check out the website at cmcfp.com. Okay, back to my dad. He's probably still talking.
We've talked about the checking accounts. We've talked about the insurance type things. Have y'all started, or when did you start talking about, well, these are sort of some of our goals for longer term? I think you mentioned maybe a lake house at some point.
Yeah.
Did y'all start having those conversations before you were married?
Yeah. So part of the fun of dating and, then engagement and whatnot is what does life look like, right? Paint this picture. Let's We kind of joke that we have these like dreaming conversations where we just say, let's dream for a minute. And what does that dream look like? If you look 15, 20 years, what does that look like? Where are we? Are we at the beach? Are we at the lake? What are we doing? And so I think those were really fun in the beginning of our relationship to talk about. And so, but then now getting married, we're now implementing those investments and implementing those dreams.
So what you were really doing is financial planning. You just didn't realize it while you were in the dating stage.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a cool thing.
Yeah.
So. Okay. I want to spend the rest of the time, when you brought this up to me, it really hit. It was like, wow. A couple would think about this before they were married. And I think the reason that y'all thought about this is because of the stage in life that you are. And I'm going to jump back to a podcast episode that I did, episode number 3, where I first started talking about cash flow. And I talked about 3 stages of financial planning and 3 stages of investing. Okay. And it's the wealth accumulation stage, which is where you are. Okay. That's from the time you graduate from college until you're about, say 50 to 55 years old.
Okay.
You're accumulating wealth. You're saving money for goals. You're trying to accumulate what you can. You're trying to grow it. You're starting to dream your word. You're starting to think about, I always talk about the why. You're starting to think about why you want to do these things. Then you reach a point 50 to 55. This is the stage that I'm in. And you're in this pre-retirement stage in life. So say from about age 50 or 55 to maybe, 65 or 67, depending on when your retirement age is. And so what you're doing there is you're trying to somewhat preserve what you've got. You're setting yourself up for retirement. And then the last stage is the stage in life where this whole question is stemming around. And that's the spending stage.
Yeah.
Now you're retired.
Right.
Okay. Now you're starting to use some of your money. You brought up to me a conversation that y'all had about your aging parents. And I thought it was fascinating that 2 people prior to getting married, while you're talking about dreaming of a lake house, which couch are we going to keep? Whose house are we going to move into? Who's going to pay for the groceries and who's going to pay for the mortgage?
Yeah.
You also had conversations around aging parents.
Right.
So let's spend some time talking about that and really kind of breaking that down.
Yeah.
What started it? Who started it? And how did that even come up?
I don't remember how it actually started or who actually brought up the conversation. And it may have been, several conversations or, watching parents go through health issues and things like that. And so I think it sort of just naturally evolved. But I think one thing to note, because we're not in our 20s, and so I think a lot of younger couples getting married automatically talk about families and growing their families, right? And I think there's something to be said for when you, and I'm not a parent, but when you have children, I imagine there's a level of control in a way that you are controlling the finances surrounding that child, right?
Right.
You are planning for that child and for their future. When you're looking at it from a parent perspective, I have no idea what Jonathan's parents' financial situation is like or vice versa. And so I think for us, it just naturally came up of our parents are retired. His parents are in their 70s. And while they're still very active, it's what does our future look like? Because we need to plan for what happens to our parents.
Mm-hmm. Again, I'm going to go back to the questionnaire that we have. One of the goals or one of the objectives that you could have is caring for aging parents. That's literally what it says on the questionnaire.
Yeah.
The reason is because this is a real thing.
Yeah.
And as people are living longer, but sometimes living longer means, maybe you have a prolonged illness or you start having some decline as you're aging. And one of the things that you talked about is and let's kind of jump into this. So if you've got, we'll talk to your parents first. Okay. What conversations did you have around that? Do you have siblings? and the role that you and Jonathan would play versus the role maybe siblings would play.
Yeah, and this is very complicated because I come from a very blended family.
Okay.
So where I am my father's only child, but I have step siblings.
Okay.
And so, and not that we were raised that way, we're all very close, but I do feel the sense of responsibility for my father, right? And equally to my mom, but it is, my siblings are not here. They're in Mobile. They're not close by. So is it that my parents are going to stay here in Birmingham and age naturally? And then are they moving in with me? Am I going to be the caretaker? Are they moving to Mobile to be closer to grandkids? And then does that fall on my siblings? Do we play an equal role in this? So who is kind of being the caretaker here?
So as you and Jonathan, you're not even married.
No.
Okay. As you're having these conversations, how did that make you feel? Did it?
I think it made me feel protected in a way. And I know that probably sounds strange, but it really just proved even more to me that he is incredibly loyal and he loves his family, right? And so the fact that he was even thinking about, oh, well, I'm always going to be there to take care of my parents, or whatever that looks like, it really just solidified to me that he is who he is.
Right.
It didn't scare me by any means.
Right.
It's intimidating. The entire subject is very scary, and getting to this stage in life where you realize that your parents are getting older is terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's happening at the same time you're trying to start
That's right.
your new life.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And so it's a interesting conversation that I think a lot of people may not think about,
Right.
or unless, what happens a lot of times is something becomes important or it becomes a goal when it becomes personal.
Mhm.
And I see that so many times in any aspect of financial planning is, when we start thinking about things is, ooh, I had an aunt that,
Right.
or my mom that,
Yeah.
or I had a friend whose mom this. Now, all of a sudden you start thinking about these sorts of things. That was something that y'all had a conversation about prior to even getting
Yeah,
married.
That's right.
One phrase that you used, which I absolutely love, and I'm going to steal, is foundational agreement.
Yep.
And I think those two words, I think that's huge. But do you feel like because y'all had that foundational agreement that helped as you're still planning for the wedding and as you're making other financial decisions and everything like that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the topic around aging parents or financial investments, our life, I think those are all ongoing conversations, and they're going to change over time, and they're going to change based on how life changes. And so I think for us to just get to the foundational agreement of, if it's parents, we know we're going to be there to care for them. No matter what, we're going to figure that out, but we're on that same page, and life can change and pivot around it, but that's our foundational agreement. Or whether it's our own personal life, we're going to invest in this, and no matter what that outcome or change, we're open to that evolution, but we have the foundational agreement at the bottom of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great because, a lot of times what happens is someone's, oh, hell no, my mother-in-law is not moving in.
Right. I love my mother-in-law.
Okay.
I love her.
And you said that. Now, this is a national podcast.
Yes,
it could be out there for everybody, for everywhere.
I
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
My in-laws are wonderful. In fact, I just got back from a trip with my sister-in-law. Like, they are wonderful people.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. You said it. And we got it on tape. So. Amanda, is this issue resolved, or is this going to be an ongoing topic of discussion?
It's always going to be ongoing until we reach that day, if that day presents itself, right?
Right.
And I think to kind of touch on what I said before, you may not always know your parents' financial situation. My parents are a little bit more reserved in how they talk about finances.
Right.
Jonathan's family's not. They're very open and very liberal with their conversations. So some of this might be a surprise as we get into down the road of what my parents' financial situation looks like, or what what their wishes are too, because it's not just about what we want.
Sure.
It's what they plan for themselves as well.
Right. It's something that, Brendan, and I had Brendan on a few episodes ago, and we talked about this whole behavioral finance and the conversations that we have around that. And one of the things that one of the questions that comes up a lot of times is around the uncertainty of knowing sort of what to expect.
Right.
And then when things do hit you, and so the question becomes, is it better to have family meetings where you sort of know the dynamic and things like that? And then we have other clients who are like, they're not going to know anything until something happens.
Yeah.
Again, not a right or a wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's just different.
It's different.
And so you have to look at that in your own personal situation. And you have to think, y'all are still planning for your financial lives with your financial puzzle.
That's right.
But here's an ancillary piece that you have to think about over here that could disrupt or may not disrupt, but you have to think about it.
We just have to think about it.
Right.
We just have to acknowledge that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the end of the day, it's just because we care about our families so much and how that looks like. But yeah, we have to acknowledge that it's there, that we will hit that point at some point.
Right.
And what might that look like?
Right. Well, I think it's fabulous that y'all had those conversations prior to getting married.
Yeah.
That was a good thing. So let me ask you this. You brought it up and you mentioned it to me. So y'all have a prenup.
We do.
Okay. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think, or I hope maybe that I say that I think the taboo of a prenup is starting to go away. The later, people are getting married later and people are having children later and things like that. And so I hope, and also by talking about this, that it reduces the taboo of a prenup.
Right.
A prenup truly is a document that just protects everyone.
Right.
It's not saying going into this, we think we're going to end this marriage or whatever that looks like. It's just saying, in case the worst happens, you're protected and so am I. It's just a document. And so I think taking that stigma away makes it very approachable. And it just made sense for us.
Mm-hmm. Do y'all have a foundational agreement on that?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's really good.
We
so it's something that that is brought up. It is a part of a financial puzzle.
Right.
It is something that we all have to kind of consider.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, I think there's a negative stigma that is changing about that. And I don't think it's a bad thing to say. Now, if that did happen, do you get your couch back or is that?
My couch is long gone.
Your couch is gone. Okay.
She is gone. Sad.
Yeah. And you've got this big bulky furniture that's still
that he can keep.
He can have his bulky furniture.
It's part of when he came into the marriage.
That's right. Amanda, this has been a fun episode because it's something that's really important, and it's something that I do think people do need to have a conversation about. Yeah. Whether you're getting married in your 20s or whether you're getting married in your 30s or 40s, you're in a little unique position because y'all were two very independent people who have now combined. But I'm going to go back to my word. You have a foundational agreement, and I love that, around financial planning and all of the different aspects of financial planning. Okay, now let me ask you one thing, and I don't know the answer to this. Have y'all done any estate planning? Do you have wills, powers of attorney, medical directives?
We don't, but I've brought it up.
Okay.
I have.
Okay, well, I know Jonathan as well, so I'm going to bring it up also.
Good.
Because I hate to see people do all of this planning and then something, God forbid, happens. Right. And you don't have your estate planning in line, because then all the planning you did can go by the wayside when you don't have that.
See, we need that.
You need that.
We need that.
You need that. Yeah. So I, as a financial advisor, that's part of what we do.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Any other wrap up thoughts?
I just think, come together on it, talk about it often.
Right.
And take the taboo away.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that finances are very emotional, and Brendan speaks to that, right?
Right.
So there's a ton of education there, but just talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Have a conversation.
That's right. Conversation.
Absolutely. So, RJ, that's all we got.
All right. Before you go, Jim, give us your contact information.
Yeah. So you can reach me at 205-510-9074. That's my direct number. You could call or text. Our website is www.cmcfp.com. And we are on all the socials, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And that's how you get in touch with us.
Sounds good, Jim. Just an interesting podcast again. Most importantly, thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook podcast. We ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review because this actually helps others find the show. Again, thank you for listening. And for everyone at the Financial Puzzle Playbook, I'm RJ Malik, and we'll see you at the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Don't forget to follow us on social media by checking the links in the description. And contact us today by visiting our website at www.cmcfp.com or give us a call at 205-510-9074. Content here is for illustrative purposes and general information only. It is not legal, tax, or individualized financial advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any specific security, or engage in any specific trading strategy. Results will vary. Past performance is no indication of future results or success. Market conditions change continuously. This commentary reflects the personal opinions, viewpoints, and analyses of CMC Financial. It does not necessarily represent those of RFG Advisory, Private Client Services, their clients, or their employees. This commentary should not be regarded as a description of advisory services provided by CMC Financial or RFG Advisory, or performance returns of any client. The views reflected in the commentary are subject to change at any time without notice. Securities offered by registered representatives of Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered by investment advisory representatives of RFG Advisory, a registered investment advisor. Private Client Services, CMC Financial, and RFG Advisory are unaffiliated entities. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where RFG Advisory and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advisory services may be rendered by RFG Advisory unless a client agreement is in place.